Thank you very much, Jan Øberg, for giving me the opportunity to interview you in these tumultuous days of importance for world history. Um, what is your evaluation of the current world situation in the context of the transition from one world order to another?
Well, that transition, and thank you for having me, is going very well for the majority part of the world. That is about 85% or more. Not the least thanks to China's various initiatives for security and a common future for humankind and the Belt and Road Initiative and all that. It's only that those who live in the West have not understood anything of that change. And if they have, they will not accept not to be dominating. And that's, of course, the end of the West. You can either join the rest of the world or you can become isolated and self-destructive. And it's a great pain in my heart to say the West today is now self-destructive. There's nobody who wants to destroy the West or occupy the US or conquer Europe or something like that. But that's how we react to everything that happens. And we feel threatened in the West because there is this situation after whatever you say, 300-400 years or whatever, where the West cannot anymore uh, dominate, decide, be the one polar that runs the rest of the world. You remember the old distinction of the first world, the second world, the third world, and the fourth world. And the fourth and the third and the second world is now moving upwards, and the first world is moving downwards. And that is painful, of course. It's painful to get very old and frail and be on your deathbed, but there's no reason to be so aggressive. And that aggression, that militarism that has swept over the whole Western world, particularly in Europe, but you wait and see with Trump, that is self-destructive because you cannot both have economic development, prosperity, welfare state, cultural creativity, technical innovation, etc., if you're also spending horrendous sums, wasting, I would say, horrendous sums on the military and preparing for war all the time. Your mind is on how to fight the next war instead of how to create the good society. And that will be self-destructive. There's no doubt in my mind. It'll be self-destructive for a few more years. Then it will be obvious even to the West that it is falling, declining. It will have a Pravda moment, as I used to call it, when they find out that most of our mainstream media have been lying to us about all these kinds of threats everywhere. And finally, I would say what happens is just natural. It's a big change. But this macro historical change that tells us that empires are going down, all empires go up and they go down again. There's no empire that has lasted forever. This is a natural law. And you can adapt to it, or you can say, I'll fight it. The more you fight it, the faster your decline will go. And I say it, as I said, with pain in my heart. I have never been anti-Western. I've never been anti-America. The Western world has given the world a lot of good things, culture, innovations, ways of living, products, ideas that were good, like freedom of speech, free media, etc. And a certain kind of democracy. It's not a democracy anymore anywhere in the West, but it was. The theories were good. And now you have basically destroyed it all. All the values of the West are now, if you will, um, uh, undermined by the West itself, not by anybody else, but by the West itself. So it's a very sad situation for the West. The rest of the world is going well.
And we have been calling for Europe and the United States to actually ally with the BRICS plus countries, the global South countries, instead of continuing their confrontation policy.
I totally agree with that.
Mhm.
But I don't think they know anything but confrontation. You take the Danish government, which is now covered by the world press, where it's completely emotionalist, totally outrageous policies and waste of money. Denmark will go down the drain very soon. And
Mhm.
that's an example of many others. I was born in Denmark, as you know. You sit in Denmark. And Denmark was a peaceful society. It was H.C. Andersen, it was all these kinds of welfare things. It was Kierkegaard. It was folk high schools. It was women's equality. It was smaller income differences. It was an ability and a will to help the world in different ways. It was strong. Sweden, as a neutral state at the time, Sweden was a country where you could count on a strong adherence to international law and to the United Nations and United peacekeeping. All these good values are gone. The only thing you can hear the Danish Prime Minister talk about is war.
Mm.
Now, she has some kind of, irrational disturbance, pathological, I would say. And she's a very powerful woman and she plays power games all the time. There's no substance behind it. There is no substance behind it. And it applies to all the other European countries. My question is, could you please give us a scenario by which Russia will take all of Ukraine, then continue to Poland and the Baltic republics and Finland and Sweden and land in Denmark or occupy the Eiffel Tower in 48 hours with its tanks? Would you please give me that scenario? For a country that has a fraction of NATO's military expenditures and weapons and manpower, and for a country that has not for 3 years been able to, you may say willing to, I'm not a military expert, but has not been able to take more than about 15%, 15, 20% of Ukraine. Now, mind you, if you occupy all of Europe, you will have to administer it too, to keep it. As if, Russia also was not big enough already. I mean, these things are fantasies. These things are constructions in the minds of people who are emotionalist, who are irrational, and who are damn dangerous. So they are adding to, believing that they are making the West strong, they are adding to the decline and the accelerating. Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, talks about accelerating and just put 50 billion Danish kroner in more after several hikes into the military yesterday. And she said 2 more years and then we will continue upwards. That is not to accelerate. That is to accelerate two things, not peace and security, but war and Western decline. She doesn't see it.
My first interview with you was actually on February 21st, 2022, just 2 days before the Russian military went into Ukraine. And the chairman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Teplerus's response was to call for a new a new international security and development architecture, where the security interests of all nations were taken into account, and the principle being one humanity first. And you spoke then at the Schiller Institute in Denmark's online seminar on the subject in May of that year. So why do you think this is important now? And what would important aspects be of such an international security and development architecture?
Well, that's very simple. Intellectually, in terms of values, the problem is how if you how to implement it with the present leaders whose mind is totally set on militarism. It's a militarist thinking. We're deep down into a cultural militarist crisis. It's very simple. A strong United Nations, reformed, much higher budgets, much more efficiency. And that's what we should talk about, because we talk far too little about the future, and we should talk much more about the future, because you cannot shape the future by means of being in the present or thinking of the past. It's like you cannot drive to your goal in a car if you only look in the rear mirror. That's what the whole Western world does, with the exception again of China, which is looking into, the front window to see where we're going the next 40 years. So future thinking is important. Common security is the only relevant theoretical or conceptual way of seeing it. We can only live on this globe together if we have common security. That is, we are safe with the others when the others are safe with us. That was the not very creative, but very important idea of the Palme Commission. The Palme Commission, Olof Palme, the prime minister who was killed shortly after. The idea that security is not against someone, it is to understand each other in such a way that we avoid misunderstandings that could lead to a blow up. Third, it means global governance that is to do something about the democracy or decision making, which today is basically national politically, but is global for those who are in the economics and the military sector. These two sectors are, if you will, intellectually more advanced because they think of the globe as one system, you know, intercontinental ballistic missiles and interventions and all that, and empire building. And people who are sitting in the finance and corporate sector, they think globally. Whereas democratically, you and I can only vote for our own government and the municipalities. That's totally grotesque. The whole political sphere is behind the economic and the military sphere in terms of maturity and relevance. So I'd like to have a global democracy. I'd like us to, for instance, elect the representatives of our countries to international bodies. I'd like to elect the person who will represent me in, be it NATO or the European Union or the United Nations or OECD or whatever. And we could, by means of modern technology, we could vote for global issues globally. If you can decide which song should be winning in the European Song Contest by SMS, why the heck can we not do something? I know it's not that easy, but I'm trying to say, why are we only allowed to vote for our prime minister, who is important, as all other prime ministers and governments are having less and less influence on the global future and our own country, because more and more of my country's decision and path into the future is decided internationally, whether the World Bank or NATO or whatever. So, fourth, it would mean defensive defense. Deterrence must go. Deterrence is a sick idea. Nobody knows what it is. Everybody talks about it. Deterrence means, let's talk, my friend, with me pointing a pistol at your head. Meaning, I can kill you where you are, 5,000 kilometers away. I don't have the intention to do so, but if you don't do what I say, or if you do something I don't like, then I'll be able to kill you. Now, then we have the naive, self-centered idea in NATO, for instance, which is built on this bizarre idea that we can persuade the Russians that we have no bad intentions and we will never use these weapons. It's the same. People say we have nuclear weapons for deterrence. This is bullshit. Sorry for my words. It's a bullshit because if both parties know that nuclear weapons will never, ever be used, then there is no deterrence. You cannot deter a cat with anything when you at the same time say, I'm never going to use it. That means there's always a possibility of using your weapons. Now, so we have no bad intentions. We just expand NATO against all promises to Mikhail Gorbachev. We also tried with Ukraine as the 11th country that we should never have gone into, but we have only good and peaceful intentions. I mean, how on earth can anybody believe that the other side, if you have empathy, which is a human value, I would say, but it doesn't exist in politics and security politics. How on earth can we accept that somebody would how can we expect, that somebody would accept that type of policy as peaceful? So defensive defense means defensive military. That means less destructive capacity, no nuclear weapons, short range. It means helicopters to protect your borders rather than fighter aircraft and intercontinental missiles. I'm just giving you a hint. The most defensive defense you have in history is the Chinese Wall. It's a very difficult thing to get over if you try to invade, but it doesn't threaten anyone. That can be done by a lot of modern technology, etc. That's what we need. And then we need a European United Nations. We need, because we have had this long-term confrontational situation, the first Cold War and now the terrible, much worse second Cold War in Europe. And therefore we need, exactly as Gorbachev said, we need a European common house where we talk about things, where we have a conflict management discussion forum, like a European Security Council with Russia, where we talk about things before they run into violence. You know, every situation can be seen as a conflict. And what we need to learn and come down from the trees and stop the military, industrial, media, academic complex is to deal with the issue, not who is right and wrong. That's a sick idea. It is what is the issue that stands between the parties here. Parties there, the issue here they cannot solve. If you take it in the Ukraine thing, it's a conflict between NATO and its expansion and Russia and its rising after it has been on its knees. And these two are pitted against each other. And they both use, to a certain extent, you say misuse, of course, Ukraine for their purposes. Now, that's not a matter of who is good and bad. It's a matter of here is a problem that the parties could not handle. It's a conflict resolution is problem solving, if you will. And that cannot be done without creativity because conflict resolution is about seeing a better future, suggesting something all the parties could live with, maybe not be 100% happy with, but could live with, so that they say, that idea for the next 10 or 20 years for my country is better than continuing the war. Now, that's what Trump has not understood a word of. He doesn't do conflict resolution. He does the, in my view, positive thing. He wants to stop the war. And the kakistocrats, the kakistocracy we're living in Europe says, now we are upset that we're not at the table. For 3 years, very soon, for 3 years, the European politicians could have talked with Putin and taken the telephone like Trump did. But these fools didn't do it. They were so cocksure that they would win. And so, serve yourselves that you're now totally marginalized. Europe is becoming a fool in the international society. And that's a pity because, it's a fool compared with or in comparison with Mr. Trump. He's only doing what he had said all the time. So back to the question of finally how to create a more secure structure of the world, I would say peace education, peace culture. Cultivate that idea. Do make people, give people a chance to do peace services instead of military service. Build down the military, industrial, media, academic complexes. We have one cluster which is outside of democratic control. Eisenhower said it in his farewell speech, wasn't you may remember better, maybe 61, 62, whatever, 61 probably, where he said we have a military industry, he called it the military industrial complex, which is outside of control and in the long run it can be a danger to the US society. Nobody's done anything to rebuild it because it's part of the deep state. It's a part of the deep state anywhere, not just in the US, in Denmark too, or Sweden or wherever we're sitting. So we have something we have to build down. We have to tear up some of these military structures that create a terrible world and a terrible waste of resources, and then build something new, as I said, defense, global governance, a stronger United Nations, a UN and the Europe, etc., etc., etc. There's no limits to what we can do with a little creativity, but there's no creativity left in politics. There's no vision. Ask any European politician, where would you like to be in 40 years? Where would you like to have your country in 40 years? They will not tell you anything you would
But
bother to listen to.
let me ask you, how can an economic development perspective and China's Belt and Road Initiative aid in the pursuit of peace? For example, in the Middle East, if it were combined with a more broad recognition of the Palestinians and also in Ukraine.
Well, let me say that it's not a simple theory, but you can say if you cooperate with, have frequent contacts with the other side, those you have a problem with, or you don't have a problem with them yet, but you don't want to have a problem with them in the future, then you build cooperative structures. You have a project together. And whenever you have a project together and you strive for equal benefits, If it's exploitative, like the West has been through vis-a-vis the third world, it doesn't work that way. But if all the parties see, hey, I'm winning something, it's a win-win, as the Chinese call it, a cooperative project or structure, then we reduce the risk of war. It's much more difficult to kill people you know, or people you're dependent on, or people who give you benefits. Whereas if you don't know people, if you exploit people or you are exploited, the hate comes up at some point, the sense of unfair treatment, the sense of, you know, this will make me in a worse and worse position means uproar. So you can build peace into structures. You can build peace into trade. You can build peace into investments. You can build peace into a multi-decade macro project as the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now, I think, encompassing more than 140 countries, just the NATO and the EU being outside, as stupid as they are, instead of participating in what is humankind's most largest and most visionary cooperative project. We're just isolating ourselves, as I said in the beginning. So there's so many things you can do if you have vision. There's so many things you can do if politics were about selling good ideas. There's so much you can do if you involve cultural people, intellectuals, ordinary citizens and their civil society organizations and asked, the time is over when politicians ask for good advice from the people. They believe that they know everything themselves and they're driving our societies to hell. But that closed-mindedness, is frightening to me. I'm so old that in all the 80s, I sat in the Danish Commission for Security and Disarmament. Also through the 80s, I was with my colleagues at Lund University, where I sit in Lund, southern Sweden. I was part of constantly writing papers for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, going up to Stockholm, sitting a whole day discussing texts. What does deterrence mean? What does this mean? How do you write this on page 2? How does that compare to what you say on page 10? It was people who were intellectuals who made decisions and wrote speeches. And I sit today and say, and I use the word kakistocracy about our leaders. Kakistocracy is the opposite of aristocracy, which I don't support either, but kakistocracy means governance by the least able and the least good people. The lack of knowledge among people who play with nuclear war in the Western world is deeply frightening to me. The weapons have always been there. Weapons is a sick idea. Seems to be weapons is something people want in all cultures. Nuclear weapons is what you see also everywhere, which is totally, immoral to have, unethical, useless, cannot be justified in any way except because the others have them, we will have them. But the lack of knowledge, the lack of being able to handle rationally complex problems, the ability to see what happens if we send the signal. You heard the word, it made me sick to hear the word signal. We're sending signals. Yeah, you're not sending signals. You're making the situation worse. These people are dangerous, and people are much more dangerous than the weapons. Because if you put terrible weapons in the hands of people who don't know what they do and are imbued with group thinking, you will at one point have a catastrophe. Because at the moment, there's nobody who can get through to deaf and blind leaders in the West and say, you are on the wrong track for the following reasons. Madam Prime Minister in Denmark, there is no threat from Russia, but you can provoke them to become threatening. There is no threat from anyone. You don't need all this military. Do something more constructive with the money you have. She can't be reached. We're in a situation in which democracy does not permit people to reach their leaders, and the leaders do not consult. Sweden signed half a year before it came up in the Swedish parliament. Sweden defense minister had signed in Washington the agreement about 17 US bases in Sweden. It's a democracy that you sign a binding agreement for 10 years with 17 bases in what was once a neutral, peace-loving Sweden. And then half a year later, you take it up in the parliament, and because of propaganda, media, and everybody else being behind that stupid, very dangerous, very counterproductive, peace-defying, peace-destroying agreement, you take it up in the parliament and it passes through. You know, that's one of the things we should be very careful about in the Western world. From the right to the left, militarism is now the answer to everything.
Mm.
You don't even have a left anymore. You don't even have a social democracy. Think of the tradition of Willy Brandt, Uro Kekkonen, Bruno Kreisky, Olof Palme, Anker Jörgensen. These people had, one, a sense of what war was. Secondly, they were intellectuals compared with today's leaders.
Let me ask
No,
you.
these things are dangerous. I'm pointing again and again to the fact, wake up, friends in the West, because otherwise, you know, what is it they say? If you sleep in a democracy, you will wake up in a dictatorship. That's a very famous quote of a German author whose name, unfortunately, I'm right now forgetting. If you sleep in democracy, let these things happen, you will wake up in a dictatorship. That's where the West is on its road to. Sorry.
The Schiller Institute has proposed many economic development programs around the world, including an oasis plan for the Middle East. And there are visions of a future we can work towards. And you have spoken now in the interview about the need to think about the future. In a recent interview, you quoted George Bernard Shaw, which Robert Kennedy Sr. also used to say very poignantly. You see things and you say why, but I dream things that never were, and I say, why not? So, why is it important to develop visions of the future to inspire people? As you say, something our Western politicians lack.
I'm very glad you're quoting this beautifully from George Bernard Shaw. I think you will find it properly back 45 to 50 years in my writings, and I don't think I've ever ended a public speech without quoting that. I deeply believe in that, and that's because one of my mentors were Johan Galtung, who always said you haven't done your job as a scholar before you have, one, done empirical analysis of reality, two, criticized it according to some values, it's not good enough, and three, suggested what should be done. Remember, the largest work on the dissolution of Yugoslavia was written by three peace researchers, including myself, Johan Galtung, and Håkan Wiberg. And we called it Yugoslavia, What Should Have Been Done. 2,000 pages online. And that is what peace research is about. It is, and that's what peace movement is about. A peace movement that can only criticize weapons is an anti-militarist movement. And that's good. It's important, but it's not a peace movement. And we basically have no peace movement today anywhere. Because people do not think of how to solve problems. They criticize what is bad, and they don't ask why not. See the world as it could be and ask why not. And that's what I see as my task as an intellectual to do, together with my colleagues in the Transnational Foundation. We've always done that. And I would say the world is far too complex and difficult and threatening to a certain extent to let the politicians decide what to do. You cannot put up, a critical study of something and then expect politicians to make it a better world. That time is gone. We could once upon a time, we had good leaders. We don't have any leaders today, only bad ones, if so. In the Western world, well, there might be a few exceptions, don't get me wrong, but the level of peace, peace has disappeared, for Christ's sake. There's no peace research left. There's no peace discussion. There's not a peace, is a word never mentioned in the media. And I haven't heard a politician recently say peace, except, weirdos like Stoltenberg saying the road to peace is weapons and warfare. I mean, we are already, Orwell would be, envious of the reality because it's way beyond what he envisioned. So all kinds of visions are so important. Idea debates, and don't shoot them down with the argument that this is not realistic. Because the only or most unrealistic thing is to do what the Western world is doing today and believing that it can survive, or that the world can survive with a West that behaves that way. We still have far too much weaponry and wrong thinking to believe in that. So I would say we need a popular uprising everywhere, protest against what is happening, but with positive visions of, all you fools, it could be done completely differently and we would all benefit. Why don't you do something good for humanity? Why do you only do something bad for your own people or evil for your own people and for humanity? It's so much more of an intellectual, moral, and cultural push than it has to do with this eternal discussion about geopolitics and who moves and do that. I'm sick and tired of all these discussions because they never come to a few exceptions like but they never get to more than commenting on the madness and interpreting the madness. We don't need that anymore.
Uh, we have 3 minutes left in our time here. I
I hope we will live
would.
longer.
Um, I First, I want to thank you so much for the interview. I invite the listeners to go to the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research homepage and the Schiller Institutes, and also participate in the weekly International Peace Coalition meetings that the Schiller Institute initiated. Last week, we had the guest, Dr. Naledi Pandor, the former foreign minister of South Africa. Very special meeting. But in with the 2 minutes we have left, uh, you are a conflict resolution expert. What are your most important advice to the governments that are negotiating now in the Middle East and Ukraine?
Get all the parties on board. Don't discuss just with one or two or three. Secondly, find out or define what is the conflict that stands between them, or the different types of conflict, the cluster of problems that they have with each other. Don't talk about who is good and who's right and good, or wrong and bad. Third, use your vision if you have any, or ask people of culture and others to have a vision for the whole Middle East. Israel and Palestine is about the whole Middle East. Johan Galtung, my mentor and dear friend over 50 years who died a year ago, made the best plan so far for the Middle East. I think it was 1973. He had been to all the places and talked with all the people on all sides. And then he applied the idea, first of all, it has to be part that what you do with Israel Palestine has to be seen in a larger regional context. How do you do a kind of economic community that everybody benefits from? How do you do reconciliation and trauma treatment after all that has been? How do you tie that in with a completely different type of security and no mass destructive weapons in the region, etc., etc.? It's a very complex peace plan. He suggested it's on transnational.live if you want to read it. Much better than anything has been suggested since then, which is done by politicians who believe that they know everything, which they don't.
Okay.
So the approach to this is, and that's a very important final thing to say, those who can mediate must not be part of the conflict. I mean, Trump trying to mediate the situation in Ukraine now, when the United States is the main reason that we have a war there. Obama's regime change in Kiev in 2014, arming Ukraine, killing Russians, expanding NATO. It's all the work of the US, of course, with the help of the NATO allies. And now you have this guy saying that we are leaving, we're doing this and that. I'm telling you,